Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 41. Well, hang on to your hats, everybody. This is some exciting stuff. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. It's great to be with you again.
I am really excited about the series that we are starting this week. Before we dive right into that material, though, just the regular housekeeping, reminding our listeners that we do have show notes over at meredithkline.com/podcast, where you can find links to things that we mentioned in the course of the episode. We appreciate the 5-star ratings that we continue to get on iTunes. Please keep those coming. If you know people who listen who have not given us a rating, please do encourage them to give us a rating. And if you have the means to contribute financially to the cost of hosting the audio files, there is a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. We are starting this week to go through Meredith Kline's next book, Images of the Spirit. So, Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you to get the conversation started.
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting book. It began as a series of articles that Meredith published in the Westminster Theological Journal in 1977 and 78. And so as he was working on those, he decided to put them together and add a fourth study into it and into the mix. And he came up with this book, Images of the Spirit. One thing that we need to point out right at the start here is, what does that title, Images of the Spirit, refer to? What are the images and what's the Spirit?
Well, that's what he's going to unpack in the book, but the Spirit obviously refers to the third person of the Trinity.
It does, although specifically in the book here, he's arguing that it's the third person of the Trinity as manifested in a theophany that he'll also refer to as the glory cloud, which our podcast is named.
That phrase is going to play a prominent role in this book for sure.
Yeah. So we could actually call this book Images of the Glory Cloud.
That's right.
And so he's going to argue that the glory cloud is like an archetype or a model that replicates itself in various ways from creation all the way through the Bible to consummation. So the images are these replicas, these earthly replicas of the glory cloud. He even uses the word clones, or the verb to clone. I thought that was hilarious. The book was published in 1980. The articles were written in 1977. I don't remember cloning being a big deal back then. But on page 21, he says, as the omega point of the creative cloning of the archetypal glory temple, the divine design, da-da-da-da. But I just thought it was amazing that he used that word cloning.
That is pretty amazing.
So we could even call this clones of the Spirit.
Not really Clone Wars. That wouldn't fit. But
okay,
anyway.
No, let's not go there.
I'm glad you used the word theophany early on, though, because that is one of his favorite words in this book. Mm-hmm. Theophany, theophanic, variations on that. And if our listeners are not familiar with that term, a theophany is a visible manifestation of God to his human creatures. Mm-hmm. And
yeah, that's helpful. Theo is from theos, and then phanic or phani is from the Greek verb phainomai, which means to be manifested or to reveal.
Okay. So a manifestation of God.
Yeah. And it's a visible, created phenomenon. It's not God himself in his absolutely spiritual being, which is utterly invisible and non-physical. It's actually a created, creaturely manifestation of God through created media, whether it's fire or cloud or even angels. Angels even have some sort of role to play in these theophanies. It's really interesting. Kline even mentions this in the book, where you'll be reading along and it talks about the cloud, and then in the very next verse it'll talk about the angel of the Lord, And so it's all interconnected.
Very good. We could almost substitute the word theophany for images, right?
Yeah.
Theophanies
right.
of the Spirit.
Yeah, that's right. That sounds better than clones of the Spirit. But that's what they are. These theophanies, these visible manifestations of God, are images that give us a concrete picture of God, and that make God visible to us in some way. Obviously, it's not God himself, but it's God revealing himself to us through created media.
Right. Okay. Maybe we should also point out from the preface that right away he says some of the central ideas of this monograph were originally developed in the course of writing another book still forthcoming. So he's saying that in 1980. Mm-hmm. And this is conjecture on my part, a little bit of speculation, but I think that the book that he's referring to there is Kingdom Prologue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was wondering the same question, and there aren't any other books that fit the bill, right?
Right.
So that seems to be the one. And I think, if I recall, see, you and I, Chris, we were students of Kline in the 90s, and in the 90s, we were using a version of Kingdom Prologue that was sort of self-published.
Right, from Kinko's.
And it was like just this, 8.by11 sheets bound together, with just sort of like glue and cover. It wasn't a very finished-looking book. But if I recall, that version of Kingdom Prologue was actually a revised version of an earlier version that went back to the 80s. Oh. And probably some of the students that he had at Gordon Conwell would have seen that earlier version.
Okay.
So probably, I think, Kingdom Prologue was basically his notes for his class that he taught over and over again at various institutions, whether it was Gordon Conwell or Westminster in Philadelphia or Escondido. Basically, Old Testament biblical theology is what it is. Mm-hmm. And, the book just sort of, he kept adding to it and expanding it and, printing different versions of it. So Kingdom Prologue really originated back in the 80s. And then, the final version, the one that everybody has now, published by Whiff and Stock, is 2006. But that was just the final version of that long evolution. Okay. So he was working on this back then.
And there is some thematic overlap, I guess, between what he talks about in Images of the Spirit and what he talks about in Kingdom Prologue. Yeah,
I think you mentioned that to me. What was that again? Something about...
Well, in the first section of chapter 1, Glory Spirit at the Creation, he starts talking about some concepts that immediately reminded me of what he talks about in Kingdom Prologue as God being both the Alpha Architect and the Omega Consummator. I'm not sure he uses those phrases in Images of the Spirit, but he's definitely working with those concepts.
That's what it was, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, Alpha Architect and Omega Consummator is definitely from Kingdom Prologue. But here in Images, you have something very close to that. On page 20, you have this sentence: the Glory Spirit was present at the beginning of creation as a sign of the telos of creation, as the Alpha archetype of the Omega Sabbath. that was the goal of creation history. So it's not quite the same as alpha architect. It's alpha archetype, but it's getting there, right? It's pretty close.
It is.
And then this idea of omega Sabbath, not quite the same as omega consummator, but it's pretty much the same idea. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think he was already working on these, creating this set of terms that then he fleshes out in more detail in Kingdom Prologue.
And so it's like he just got all excited about these theophanies of the Spirit and had to put together this book.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I think it's also kind of interesting to see here a reference to his son, Meredith M. Kline.
That was interesting.
Yeah, he has a footnote 5 in chapter 1. He says that his son did a THM dissertation at Westminster Theological Seminary titled The Holy Spirit as Covenant Witness, dated 1972. And then, even more amazingly to me, he mentions the fact that after he finished writing the book, just before it went to press, he discovered that a Roman Catholic scholar named Luzarraga had written a dissertation in 1973 on the whole issue of the cloud in the Old Testament and its relationship to the Holy Spirit.
I do remember that.
Yeah, and the title of that book, he lists it here. It's in the same footnote as the one on M.M. Kline. He says, he gives the title, and it looks to me like it's in Spanish. So that's amazing to me that he was able to interact with a Spanish, a dissertation written in Spanish.
That is amazing. It says it came into his hands just a few days ago.
Yeah, that's right.
He even mentions his son, Meredith M., towards the end of the preface. It says, I want to express my special gratitude to my son, Meredith M. Kline, to Meredith for our continuing conversation over the years on the leading ideas of this work. So I picture father and son, hashing out the ideas that he's working with here.
Yeah, absolutely. Having somebody to talk to and to bounce these ideas off of, or you're saying, am I crazy or is this in the text?
Right.
I'm sure that happened.
Okay. Shall we officially dive into the book here?
Yeah, I guess we should just do that. We should just rip off our clothes, get down to our trunks, and just dive into the pool.
All right. So chapter 1 is the glory spirit and his human image. And he begins by noting that systematic theology has tended to approach the task of defining what the image of God means by analyzing what constitutes humanness. And Kline somewhat gently pushes back on that and says that the question of what is man, or what does it mean to be human, is not the same question as what is the image of God.
Yeah.
And I think that really sets the tone for what he's going to do in this book.
Yeah, definitely. And he's going to spend some significant time here at the end of this chapter, on pages 26 to the end, which he subtitles Toward a Reconstruction of the Image of God concept. And he's going to say, in light of this whole idea that the glory cloud is a theophany of the third person of the Trinity, what implications does that have for the image of God? Because the image of God is one of the first clones, one of the first replicas or images of the glory cloud in Scripture.
And so he's really going to be offering what to his mind was a correction to systematic theology up to that point in that final section there. Yeah.
He wants to do biblical theology in order to help us to to clarify our systematic theology.
Right.
Systematic theology has what he calls the traditional dogmatic wineskins, and needs to be given some fresh insight from biblical theology.
Well, this book is packed with that fresh insight.
Yeah, in this first chapter, I have to say, for anyone who's going to be reading through this with us, it is a packed chapter for being only a brief 21 pages or so, 22 pages. It is solid, and you really have to take it slowly, paragraph by paragraph, and digest it, because there's a lot in here. But Absolutely. We can start off. We're not going to be able to get to this whole issue of how does Kline reconstruct the image of God concept based on his biblical theological analysis of the glory cloud. We're not going to get to that in this episode. We're going to focus on the first section here of this chapter called The Glory Spirit at the Creation. So he starts off right at the very beginning with pointing us to Genesis 1, verse 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
And he really picks up on the verb there, hovering, merachefet, and makes a connection between that and another passage in the Pentateuch in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Let me get over
That's
there.
right. Yeah, so let's go ahead and read that verse. Deuteronomy 32. I'll be reading here from the ESV, but I have to warn you that there is a translation issue.
That's right.
So the ESV says, so this is Deuteronomy 32. This is the Song of Moses. And he's recounting the way in which God brought Israel out of Egypt. So 32:10, he found him. So he is the Lord. Him is Jacob. He found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness, he encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. And then verse 11, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young. So that's the translation issue. The word flutters here should more accurately be translated hovers, in order to show the connection with Genesis 1, verse 2. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. The Lord alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. So this is referring to the wilderness experience of Israel, and the fact that even though they're in the wilderness, the Lord is present with them and is, in a sense, hovering over them. And so Kline sees this as a reference to the glory cloud that protected Israel, that not only hovered over them, but also led them through the wilderness, guided them, was like an eagle that was protecting them and caring for them, and then guiding them to the promised land. So the verb that's used there, it's the same root, even though it's a different form, but yirachef. It's close to mirachefet, but it's the same triliteral root, reshchet, and pay. So that's Kline's argument then for saying that when you read about the Spirit of God in Genesis 1:2 hovering over the face of the waters, you have to take that Spirit there as a reference to the glory cloud. Yes, it is the third person of the Godhead, but it's the third person of the Godhead in this theophanic form that is also referred to as the cloud or the glory that accompanied Israel, not only through the wilderness, but even at the Exodus itself, and also the cloud that took up residence in the tabernacle.
And I think that's somewhat implied in the verb itself, right? I mean, otherwise, if it's not a theophany, if it's not a visible manifestation, then really all Moses is saying in Genesis 1:2 is that the Spirit was there at creation.
Right, and the Spirit being the third person of the Godhead, is omnipresent. So what's the point of saying that the Spirit was literally located over the face of the waters, right?
Right.
So it can't be a reference to the ontological, spiritual, divine nature. It has to be this theophany.
Right. And then,
just like in the Gospels, when it says that the Spirit came upon Christ at his baptism in the form of a dove.
Right. Yeah, there's another theophany of the Holy Spirit.
Right. And by the way, I just want to add a little footnote here for anybody who's interested. This is kind of a tangent, but I just recently read Augustine's treatise on the Trinity. And Augustine has a very lengthy section in there where he deals with all of these theophanies. And he deals with the dove, and he deals with the glory cloud, he deals with the angel of the Lord. And he takes all of these theophanies as basically being, he says they could be interpreted in one of two ways. They're either God using created media and then, organizing the created media to create these visible manifestations, whether it's a fire or a cloud or a dove. Or he says they could actually be angels. And he thinks that that's what they are, is that they're angels taking on these forms. So that's an interesting argument. I don't know if Kline would go that far, but Kline definitely does see that the angels are connected with these theophanies.
Right.
Very closely.
He'll get to that later in this chapter.
Yeah. But I just thought it was interesting that, here's Augustine, this great, church father who's doing this wonderful treatise on the triune nature of God. And, a lot of people think, oh, those guys like Augustine, they were just, influenced by Platonic philosophy. And so they're just thinking in very metaphysical and abstract terms. And that is true to some degree, because later on in that treatise, Augustine does get into some kind of interesting arguments about psychology and how the human makeup of mind and memory and will and so on is like an image of the Trinity, and it gets kind of abstract in that later section of the treatise. But earlier on in the first few books, it's very exegetical, and he just goes through each of these theophanies text by text by text. He talks about the three men that visited Abraham at his tent, and one of them seems to be the primary spokesperson, called the angel of the Lord, and the other two are angels. And he gets into all of these theophanies all throughout the scriptures, and he sees all of these as being foreshadows of the Trinity, or maybe just sometimes they're only indications of one person of the Godhead. Like sometimes, like the Spirit of God here in Genesis 1:2, that's clearly a theophany of the third person. In other cases, he'll say, maybe the Son of Man that comes to the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7, that's the second person of the Trinity. In other cases, you see all three persons. So it's an interesting exegetical argument that Augustine is making there. And I think there's a lot, as I was reading it, I was thinking, wow, this is very similar to Kline. And, you can see a lot of fruitful connections there between Kline and Augustine on that.
I'll have to read that.
Anyway, end of tangent.
Okay. Well, then, returning to the parallels that Kline is seeing here between Genesis 1 and Deuteronomy 32, we should point out that he sees another linguistic connection there, this time between the word formless in Deuteronomy 32:10, which I'm glad you read as part of that passage, and how the earth was formless in Genesis 1.
Right. Yeah, he found him in a desert land in the howling waste of the wilderness.
So again, the ESV translators chose different wording there, but the Hebrew word is the same. It's tohu.
That's right.
So that idea of wasteland, or just unformed mass.
Mm-hmm. And so that brings up an interesting point, which is that Kline would argue that when you're looking at the Exodus event, and even to some extent the wilderness wanderings after that, what you're seeing is a recreation. You're seeing a creation motif going back to Genesis 1, but it's in the context of redemption, so it's new creation.
Right.
God is gathering his people and creating a new humanity. And Israel is going to be the image of God, or the Son of God, to use the language that you find in Exodus 4. But of course, Kline would say that image and son are correlative concepts. So that's why you have all these parallels between Genesis 1 and the Exodus account. Of course, here in Deuteronomy, we're looking at the later, looking back upon the Exodus, but it's still that particular point in redemptive history.
Right. And in just a few pages, he will see a connection even with the flood. I think he fleshes that out even more in Kingdom Prologue. Mm-hmm. But even the flood is a recreation event.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that's right.
Okay, so we've got the verb hovering, which connects Genesis 1 and Deuteronomy 32, and the fact that this visible manifestation of the third person of the Trinity is doing this hovering over formlessness.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, he turns to talk about another set of theophanies that Israel experienced in the wilderness, and that's the pillar of cloud and fire that accompanied them and led them through the wilderness. He says that the Spirit of God in those instances is a designation for the theophanic glory cloud.
That's right.
And he talks about some other Old Testament passages that make that same point that I actually thought were very helpful. Let's see if I can get to Nehemiah 9 here. Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 19 and 20. I'll back up a little bit just for context. Verse 18. Even when they had made for themselves a golden calf and said, "This is your God who brought you up out of Egypt," and had committed great blasphemies, you in your great mercies did not forsake them in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud to lead them in the way did not depart from them by day, nor the pillar of fire by night to light for them the way by which they should go. So there, even Nehemiah is connecting the pillar of cloud and of fire to a visible manifestation of God himself, because it was God who was leading them.
Yeah, you're right. The pronoun you.
Mm-hmm.
You did not forsake them. What's the evidence? That the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire did not depart from them. Yeah. And then in verse 20, you have a reference to the Spirit. You gave your good Spirit to instruct them.
Wow, right on the heels of that.
So that's helpful, because then it's another way of clinching the connection, because Genesis 1:2 doesn't say glory cloud, it says Spirit, the Spirit of God. And, you're just still wondering, is that really the glory cloud? Well, here you have another passage in Nehemiah 9 that connects the two. And also Isaiah 63 and verses 11 through 14. Well, going back to verse 10, but they rebelled and grieved his Holy Spirit. Therefore he turned to be their enemy and himself fought against them. Then he remembered the days of old of Moses and his people. Where is he who brought them up out of the sea with the shepherds of his flock? Where is he who put in the midst of them his Holy Spirit, who caused his glorious arm to go at the right hand of Moses, who divided the waters before them to make for himself an everlasting name, who led them through the depths? Like a horse in the desert, they did not stumble. Like livestock that go down into the valley, the Spirit of the Lord gave them rest. So you led your people to make for yourself a glorious name. So all throughout here, the glory cloud is called the Spirit, even the Holy Spirit.
Right.
So yeah, again, this goes back to what we were saying about that dissertation in Spanish. That guy apparently was one of the authors that helped Kline. And even though Kline had done most of the work before he found the book, what was interesting about it to him was that Luzarraga cited evidence from the church fathers that even made this connection between the Holy Spirit and the cloud. So it's not something, it's reassuring to know
right,
that, look, Kline is seeing these things in the text. Yeah, it seems to be connecting those two things. And yeah, even the church fathers saw that.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing when you realize that Augustine has seen the same things that you're seeing.
Exactly.
Let's maybe look at one more, Haggai 2:5.
Okay. This is good. I'm glad that we're doing this. Digging into the text.
Yes.
We're not just saying, oh, Kline thinks this and Kline thinks that. We're saying, look, Kline is seeing stuff in the text. So let's see what he's seeing.
Exactly. And that's exciting, is spending the time in the text, seeing it.
Yeah.
Okay, starting at verse 4. Now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts, according to the covenant that I made with you when you came out of Egypt. My spirit remains in your midst. Fear not. And he does go on, but there he's connecting the Spirit of God with the presence that was with them when they came out of Egypt.
That's right.
And I think the phrase there, remains in your midst, really does connect it to the glory cloud, because that's what was in the midst of Israel, was the pillar of cloud and fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then going back again to Nehemiah, remember Nehemiah said, what was the proof that you didn't depart from them, that you didn't forsake them? Well, it's the fact that the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud did not depart from them.
Right.
And another thing, too, that I'd like to just mention here, I don't know if Kline mentions this, but notice the references to glory right here in Haggai 2, right? Because it talks about how the people who are there coming back into the land and rebuilding the temple, and they remember the former glory of the temple, and so this new rebuilt temple just seems so insignificant in their eyes. But so it talks about the glory there in verse 3, who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory. And then again in verse 7, I will shake all nations so that the treasures of all nations shall come in, and I will fill this house with glory. In verse 9, the latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former. So you have all of these interconnected concepts. You have spirit, you have glory, you also have the cloud. And I think it's interesting too. I hope you don't mind if I just make another footnote here, but you know how Kline talks, all throughout this section here in Images of the Spirit about the glory cloud, and that's the title of our podcast. And some people might wonder, where does he get that from? The Bible itself never uses that exact terminology, glory-cloud, but it's so derived from the text. I mean, just look at, I'll just give you some examples here where you see how the cloud and the glory are so interchangeable. For example, in Exodus 24, remember when they sprinkle the blood on the covenant, on the book of the covenant, and on the people, and then the Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders go up to have communion with God. And then it says, Exodus 24, verse 15, just listen for the word cloud and for the word glory. So Exodus 24:15. Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud, and went up on the mountain.
Wow.
So it's not surprising that Kline would come up with this term, right?
Right.
The glory cloud. That's what it is. You see the same thing at the very end of Exodus after they finished building the tabernacle. Exodus 40, verse 34, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they would not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel.
I can just see Meredith saying, how many of these passages do you need to conclude that glory goes with cloud and cloud goes with glory?
Right. Exactly.
I think of Isaiah 6 as well, with Isaiah's vision in the temple.
Right.
I'm trying to recall, get there, if it mentions a cloud, but definitely glory is involved there.
Yep. I'm looking at it right now. I don't see cloud, but yeah, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.
It was filled with smoke.
Okay, there's smoke.
And I would argue that the train of the robe is a visible manifestation that would be somewhat like a cloud.
Right.
So.
And once again, what do you have? You have 6 winged seraphim.
Yes, here you have the angels right smack in the middle of this visible manifestation.
But the point is that they're not just angels, they're winged angels that fly. Mm-hmm. And Kline is we're kind of jumping ahead here, but Kline's going to bring that out. That's why the hovering metaphor is used. Hovering, of course, is an avian metaphor. And so, we even saw that, right, with the eagle's wings. And so he thinks that the reason for that avian metaphor is because of the presence of the angels within the glory cloud.
Wow. In the context where he's talking about the pillar of cloud and of fire that led Israel through the wilderness, and then making those connections to the other passages that we've just talked about, he also says that the work of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost is parallel to the function of the glory cloud at the Exodus and the building of the tabernacle. Can you say more about that? Because to me, that was a little bit cryptic. It was just like one sentence and he was moving on.
Yeah, definitely. There are definite connections with Pentecost. The fact that the Spirit is poured out at Pentecost, and as a result of that pouring out of the Spirit, you have the creation of the eschatological temple, which is the church. Okay. Composed of both Jews and Gentiles. And so, of course, that connects you back to the Old Testament and to, the verse we were just looking at the end of Exodus. After the tabernacle is finished, the glory cloud comes and takes up residence within it.
Okay. That's helpful.
And then another interesting thing, so we're on page 15 of Images of the Spirit. He also talks about the word spirit itself, which in Hebrew is ruach. And of course, ruach can also be translated as wind.
Right.
And there are even some passages in the Old Testament where you're not sure how to translate it. Is it wind, or is it breath, or is it the Spirit with a capital S? It's not really clear sometimes. But Kline is going to draw upon that ambivalence and show that one of the images of the Spirit is this idea of the Spirit riding on the chariot and then coming with the wind. And so the wind metaphor is often connected with the Holy Spirit and with the glory cloud. And he ties that to, after the flood, when God brought a wind to cause the waters to subside in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. Let me see if I can get that real quick here. Genesis 8. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. So that's the Ruach. And then again, the wind comes up again in Exodus 14 at the crossing of the Red Sea.
Right. A very similar context in terms of the wind and the water. Mm-hmm. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. We have
that not only sounds a lot like Noah in after the flood in Genesis 8:1, it also sounds a little bit like creation.
It does.
The waters being divided,
mm-hmm.
And then the dry land appears. So that brings out again what we just mentioned before, that that you can make these connections from Genesis 1 to the flood to the Exodus and see those as all creation motifs.
Wow. And then he moves from there to consider other instances, aspects of the image of God, and he compares Genesis 1:2 with Hebrews 1 verses 2 and 3. He says what Genesis 1:2 identifies as spirit, Hebrews 1 verses 2 and 3 identifies as son. God is one. Yeah,
this is a really interesting part of the argument here, where he delves a little bit into some Trinitarian thoughts here, and it's fascinating. He likes to show. He wants to show that the glory cloud, even though we've been saying it's just a theophany of the third person of the Godhead, he wants us to see that you can't make it so tight that you just view it as being nothing but a theophany of the third person of the Godhead.
Right.
He wants us to see that this glory cloud really is a theophany of God himself, the triune God.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is going to have aspects that reveal not only the third person of the Godhead, but also the Father and the Son. And he uses Hebrews 1 verses 2 and 3 as his argument for that. So Hebrews 1, let's just look at it here. The famous passage, long ago at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. And so you see here certain ideas that tie back to the glory cloud, such as this idea of the radiance of the glory, mm-hmm. and the fact that he's present at creation, right? Through him, he created the world. And also the fact that he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Kline even points out that verb in Greek that he upholds, it's the verb pharaoh in Greek, which is very closely related to Genesis 1:2, because in the Septuagint of Genesis 1:2, the verb hover mm-hmm. is translated with the Greek verb epipharo, which is basically pharaoh with the preposition in front of it. So he's making all these interesting connections that really are fruitful for helping us to understand how the theophanies of the Old Testament are Trinitarian in nature.
Wow. Yeah, we don't really get the cloud so much here in Hebrews 1, but I was struck by the Son's presence at creation, mm-hmm. the radiance of the glory of God, and then that phrase, the exact imprint of his nature, mm-hmm. which is connecting this to the image of God.
That's right. Yeah, although the Greek word there is karakter, it's not the word eikon, which is the word typically used for image.
Okay.
But it's the same idea. The karakter is the stamp that is created when a die is stamped onto a coin. That's how they made coins. They would have, a die, and then they would just hammer it onto the metal and create each coin that way. So Christ is being described here as the resulting coin that is the image of the Father. Now, what's really interesting here, Chris, is that Kline argues, I don't know if I agree with him exegetically, but he argues that this reference to the Son as the effulgence of God's glory and the very image or the exact imprint of his being, that this reference to the Son here is not a description of the ontological Son prior to his incarnation, but neither is it a reference to the incarnate Son. He takes it as a reference to the pre-incarnation theophany of the Son.
Wow.
Or theophanies, we should say, plural. For example, Daniel 7, one like the Son of Man is brought before the Ancient of Days. Clearly the Ancient of Days is the Father.
Right. And
the one like the Son of Man must be the Son. Jesus himself quotes that and says, that he is the Son of Man. And he says to the high priest at his trial, henceforth you'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. So we know that is Christ, but it's a pre-incarnate theophany of Christ.
Okay. So that's what Kline is saying is going on here in Hebrews 1.
That's his interpretation of Hebrews 1:3.
But you're not necessarily convinced.
Yeah, I don't know. I need to look at it more and think about it, but I just think it's an interesting argument that he's making. But you can see why he wants to make that connection, because he wants to connect this to this idea of theophany. So,
right.
And he wants us to see that these theophanies of God in the Old Testament are not exclusively, just only the Spirit or only the Son, but that there's a Trinitarian flavor to these theophanies. And sometimes one person of the Godhead is more clearly emphasized or brought out, but the other two persons are also there in some way.
And occasionally we do have the New Testament giving us, an authoritative interpretation saying, this instance was the Son.
Exactly. He makes another interesting point. This is later on in the chapter, and we're not going to get this far in this episode, but that revelation of Christ that John sees in the book of Revelation, chapter 1?
Yes.
And, he's in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. He sees Christ. Kline argues that the image that John sees of Christ is a blend of all three persons. So it has the glory Spirit and the angel of the presence there, but it also has some aspects of the Ancient of Days, and it's clearly the Son of Man, because Daniel 7 verse 9 is being alluded to there, and even says one like the Son of Man. So he sees the image of Christ, so it's a theophany of Christ that John saw, but he sees that theophany of Christ as a Trinitarian theophany.
Wow.
It's pretty mind-blowing stuff, but because of the blending of these three images.
For our listeners, this is just one of many reasons why we are not covering this entire chapter in this one episode, just because I think everybody's minds would just melt if we tried to comprehend all of this material in one episode.
I know. My mind was melting as I was reading this chapter in preparation for this. I was just going, man, it's only 21 pages and I'm still struggling here.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's good stuff.
But I hope that you and I talking through this is helpful for our listeners as they read through the book, because I know for myself That was tremendously helpful to sit in class and have Kline himself talk through it as we were reading through it. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, hearing him talk it through, it just makes it so much more real and understandable than trying to power through his dense prose all on your own.
Right.
I pity people who are trying to get Kline just by reading. It's just tough. It's really tough.
Yeah. Okay. I think we have maybe one more point in this first section of chapter 1 where he talks about, actually, I take that back. What about the angel of the presence? Because that gets connected to the second person of the Trinity as well.
That's right.
One of the places that's mentioned is back in Isaiah 63, where we were a little bit earlier.
That's right. Yeah, let's go back and look at that. Isaiah 63. We started reading at verse 10. But if you go back to verse 9, it says, "In all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his pity he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old." So the angel of the presence is the same as the angel that God tells them is going to lead them up and take them into the land. I'm trying to remember where exactly that was. Exodus 23. So you have, the 10 Commandments in Exodus 19. Then you have some civil laws and so on, laws about social relationships. Then Exodus 23, verse 20, "Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way, and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Be careful, pay careful attention to him, and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him." And then verse 23, "When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and the Hittites," and so on. So this is the angel of the presence who's going to lead them into the land. Isaiah talks about that as the angel of the presence. So again, we have this idea of it's probably a pre-incarnate theophany of the second person of the Godhead, of the Son of God. But yet at the same time, we can't separate it too much from the glory cloud. The glory cloud is very closely related to this angel. The angel and the glory cloud are associated. We saw that in Isaiah 63, right after mentioning the angel of the presence. Then it goes on to talk about the Spirit. And also in Exodus 32, we have this passage. This is the golden calf. Exodus 32, verse 2. "So Aaron said to them, 'Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me.'" And then verses 12 through 15. Actually, I should say it's really Exodus 32, verse 1. "Up, make gods who shall go before us." So there's that idea of going before you. That's what the angel of the Lord is going to do.
Okay. And
then skipping down to verse 11, Kline sometimes uses the versification from the Hebrew Bible. So things are off by one verse sometimes.
Okay.
But down in verse 11, I'm reading from the English. "But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand?'" So there's this idea of who is the one that brings them up? Is it the angel of the presence that goes before them? Is it the angel of the Lord? Is it the glory cloud? Or is it Yahweh?
Mm-hmm.
And so all these things are interconnected. And again, Kline is seeing them as fully Trinitarian. So it's not surprising that sometimes you'll have a shading where, okay, it seems to be clearly this one person of the Godhead, but then the other two are in the background and you can't eliminate them. Now, another key point here, beginning on page 17 through 17, 18, and 19, in this section here, what Kline is doing is he said, okay, so what he's established at this point, the argument is that when you see a reference to the Spirit of God in Genesis 1:2, that is the glory cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's also brought in, the first and the second person of the Trinity too, in their appropriate ways, as those other persons of the Godhead are brought out in various points. But now what he wants to ask is, so we've identified the Spirit of God in Genesis 1:2 with the glory cloud. Well, what is the glory cloud?
Right.
That's the next step of the argument here. And so in pages 17 through 19, he's saying, well, the glory cloud is basically God himself in his heavenly arena. So he says in page 17, when the inner reality veiled within the theophanic cloud is revealed, we behold God in his heaven. So if you were able to enter into the glory cloud, which of course we know that at points there are individuals that do that, like Moses, right?
Right.
He went up into the mountain and he entered into the glory cloud. If you were to enter into that cloud, what do you see? You see heaven. You see the same thing you mentioned before, the picture of Yahweh seated upon his throne, Isaiah 6,
mm-hmm.
With the sea of glass and his robe filling the temple. And of course, there's angels all around, cherubim and seraphim.
Winged angels.
Yeah, winged angels. And so what he's dealing with here in this section of the argument is to say that the glory cloud is essentially heaven itself. It's the place of God's enthronement. And at the center of the glory cloud is a throne. And surrounding the throne, you have the divine council of the angels.
He essentially says that it is heaven, doesn't he? And I'm trying to find exactly where he says that. But I guess what really struck me when I read that is that I read something very similar in Voss, where he describes the Holy Spirit as being sort of the atmosphere of heaven itself.
Yeah.
I'm not finding the sentence that I...
Well, there's a bunch of sentences on page 17 here that come pretty close to saying that it is heaven, but he just doesn't say it is heaven. He just says things like, when the inner reality veiled within the theophany is revealed, we behold God in his heaven.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
Or he'll say, God's theophanic glory is the glory of royal majesty. At the center of the heavens, within the veil of the glory cloud, is found a throne. As at the bottom of page 17. And then he just goes on here to describe some of the different aspects of this glory cloud that we see throughout the Bible. You see the throne. Sometimes it's not a static throne, but it's a mobile throne, and so then it becomes a chariot. A chariot throne, he'll
you
even
beat me
say.
to it. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, you see that in Ezekiel 1, right? The wheels. It's God's throne, but it has wheels, and then the wheels are spinning around, and then what happens? Well, the throne departs, and the temple is now called Ichabod because the glory has departed. Some other things that you see here, and here he's referring to the actual physical phenomena that people see in the Old Testament. They'll see light, they'll see clouds, they'll see a sky, something like a sky. Remember in Exodus 24 when they go up to, when Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel go up into the mountain, it says that they saw, let me get the exact language here. They saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. That's Exodus 24, verse 9 and 10. So there's a pavement. Sometimes it's called a sea of glass in Revelation. And it's very clear, just like the heavens. And so that's what the sky is. The sky is an earthly replica of that heavenly reality of God's throne room. Some other things that you'll see is a whirlwind. There will often be thunders and lightnings. The main thing is this idea of light, literal light. When it talks about the cloud that accompanied Israel throughout the wilderness, don't just think of atmospheric clouds that are just pretty dark and, just watery. Think of a bright, luminous cloud that has this ability to project light.
Hence part of the design that we used in the logo for our podcast. It's got those beams of light coming out of the cloud.
That's right. And I was reading actually in Matthew, when Matthew talks about the transfiguration, it says that a bright cloud overshadowed them.
Oh, wow.
Not just a cloud, a bright cloud.
A bright cloud.
So again, it's this idea of a luminous cloud of light that radiates and illuminates and penetrates the darkness.
Wow. And he talks about other forms that light will sometimes take, like a rainbow. In that context, he mentions wisdom and truth, which I don't always think of in terms of kind of the luminous cloud idea, but I think I see what he's getting at. Judicial.
Well, if you think of light as something that penetrates the darkness,
right. And so, in that same regard, judicial righteousness,
exposing the works of darkness. Quoting there from page 18.
Judgment. And then also the burning oven. Like, I don't know, the first thing that comes to mind is Genesis 15.
Right, that's right. That was definitely a theophany. It was one of the earlier revelations of the glory cloud, even before the Exodus.
Right. So, lots of different ways in which God's royal light has been manifested.
Oh, another cool one is that sometimes there's anthropomorphisms in there, right?
Absolutely. Those are very interesting.
The glory cloud is sometimes referred to as God's arm or God's hand or even God's finger, right? The finger of God. The Ten Commandments were written with the finger of God. And that reminds me of in the Gospels when Jesus says, if I by the finger of God cast out demons. And then in a parallel gospel, it'll say the Spirit of God. So there's anthropomorphisms. He even argues that the fact that beginning in the Exodus period, you have the two. You have the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. So you have this double reference to two pillars. And he takes that as being an anthropomorphism in which we're supposed to picture God standing as a divine witness, and the two columns are the two pillars are God's legs.
Right.
And then he ties that in with Revelation chapter 10 that specifically mentions an angel that is clothed with a cloud and has a rainbow and a face like the sun, and the feet are like pillars of fire, right? Standing over the creation. So it's just very interesting.
It is very interesting.
Now, with that issue of the God standing in the two legs there, he takes that as being God standing in the stance of someone who is taking an oath.
Right.
And so he brings out the whole idea that one of the functions of the glory cloud is to be present at the making of covenants. You mentioned Genesis 15. But also, Genesis 1-2, the fact that the glory cloud is hovering over the tohu and the bohu in Genesis 1-2, that's telling you right there at the very beginning that creation itself is covenantal, and that God is not only creating, but in the act of creating, and by issuing those creative fiats, he is making a covenant of creation. and is promising to bring about a consummation that will again involve the glory cloud, in which the glory cloud will glorify all of creation.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you made that connection.
And another thing too is, remember the theophany of the Spirit at the baptism of Jesus
as the dove. And so we're supposed to immediately think two things. One, this is recreation, new creation. Going back to Genesis 1:2, there's the Spirit hovering over Christ. But secondly, we're also supposed to think this is a new covenant. Wow, that's a powerful connection to covenant making at creation.
Yeah. And I would argue that what is that covenant that you're watching there when you see the voice of the Father coming out of heaven and you see the dove descending upon the Son, and the voice says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Of course, it's the new covenant, but it's really the covenant behind the new covenant, isn't it? It's the covenant of redemption.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and there's the obedient Son, who is the second Adam, and he's coming to fulfill all righteousness and to establish that new covenant with his people.
Wow.
So, once again, we talked about this when we were looking at Kline's interpretation of the gospel genre as being based on the book of Exodus, even though the covenant is explicitly mentioned only at the very end in the Last Supper when Jesus says, "This is my covenant in my blood." You can't just, literalistically say it's only there. You have to see all the gospel as being covenantal in its character, and that you have to look at what's going on and see the biblical imagery here. When you see the dove coming upon Christ and you hear the voice from heaven, you're supposed to understand, okay, this is a covenant here. Even though the word isn't used, that's what you're seeing.
Right. We learn from the drama in the Bible as well. It's not there just for entertainment.
Right. And then one last thing I'd like to just bring out is this issue of the rainbow, where he says, bottom of page 19, "Here is the background for the later use of the rainbow as a sign of God's covenant with the earth in Genesis 9. And I think didn't we have a question about this? I think a listener to the podcast.
Oh, yes.
Brought this up. And I think this is part of the answer here. So the question was, going back to the episode that we did on common grace, and we were strongly emphasizing that the covenant of common grace is not eschatological, right? It's just common grace, and common grace is temporary. It begins after the fall, and it continues all the way up until the eschaton, until the second coming of Christ, and then it's terminated, right? And so the common grace order is something that God is promising to preserve as a temporary thing, as the kind of the playing field, the backdrop for the unfolding of his plan of redemption. But it's just common grace. It's not redemptive grace, and it's not eschatological. But then that raises the question, well, then why does God put the rainbow there? Because the rainbow, as the sign of that covenant, does seem to have more of an eschatological significance to it, especially when you fast forward to the book of Revelation, right? And John sees the vision of God and the Lamb upon the throne, and there's a rainbow behind the throne. And so I think I really think that there is a connection here, and I think that Kline is getting at that. I think what he's saying is that even though the covenant of common grace is not eschatological, nevertheless, it does contain within it an eschatological promise, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because God is promising never again to destroy the earth, meaning that, okay, there will be a purifying judgment at the end, and all the wicked will be destroyed. That's true. But he's not going to destroy the earth. He's going to bring it to consummation. He's going to eschatologize it. He's going to heavenize it.
Heavenize, yes.
So the rainbow, even though common grace does come to an end, the rainbow is still there as a sign that the reason why God is putting this common grace order into place is because ultimately he is going to fulfill the original plan of creation, going all the way back to Genesis 1-2, the glory cloud hovering over the surface. That glory cloud is like a rainbow hovering over the waters, right?
Right.
And so God is going to bring about, even in spite of man's sin, God is going to bring about the eschatological consummation that he had in view at the very beginning.
Wow. I really like that. So let the one with eyes to see the eschatological message that is offered in the rainbow.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that up.
Well, I think that's good for now. We have a few more pages to go in chapter 1, but I think that's a good start.
That is. We will go ahead and wrap up this episode here, and then next week we will pick back up with the last 2 sections of this chapter. So I'm really looking forward to that. Lee, thank you very much for discussing this with me. I've really appreciated it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for tuning in this week. If you have initial thoughts, questions, comments, please send them to us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com, and we will see you next week.